I grew up in a quiet little town where nothing ever seemed extraordinary. And my father? Well, to everyone, including me, he was just an accountant in a local firm. He lived a routine life. Same work hours, same dinner at 6, same questions about my homework. He was steady, predictable, safe. But as a kid, I never asked too much. I thought that was simply who he was. A man who spent his days balancing numbers, not someone who had stories to tell. That belief stayed with me for years, until the afternoon I stumbled upon a dusty old box in our attic. A box that didn't belong to an accountant. The attic smelled like dust and old wood, the kind of place you'd expect to find Christmas ornaments or broken lamps. But this box was different. It wasn't tucked away in some forgotten corner. It sat right in the middle, almost waiting for me. The cardboard was worn, edges taped and retaped over the years. My name wasn't written on it, but my father's handwriting marked the top in neat block letters, private. He never used that word around us. My father was open about bills, about chores, even about politics at the dinner table. But this was a side of him I didn't know. I hesitated before pulling back the lid. Inside, I expected old receipts or maybe tax files, boring accountant stuff. But what I found made my hands tremble. There were medals, heavy, cold to the touch, each one gleaming even through the dust. Ribbons in colors I didn't recognize. A small stack of photographs, black and white, frayed at the edges, of men in uniform, rifles slung across their shoulders, standing in what looked like burned-out villages. And at the very bottom, a folded letter. The paper was yellowed, words scribbled in haste, signed with a name I didn't recognize. In that attic, with the afternoon sun cutting through the dust, one truth hit me hard. My father was not just an accountant. He was something else, something he had hidden. I carried the box downstairs like it might shatter in my hands. For hours, I sat at the kitchen table, medals spread out in front of me, photographs lined up like puzzle pieces. I knew nothing about the army, nothing about wars beyond what we skimmed over in high school textbooks. But I knew enough to recognize the weight of what I was holding. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt different, almost hostile, as if the walls had known the truth all along and had been keeping it from me. My father's laugh, his quiet routine, his neat rows of spreadsheets, they clashed violently with the images of rifles and burning villages staring back at me from those photographs. So I did what anyone would do. I Googled. At first, the search was random. Military medals, insignias, uniform patches. Slowly, patterns began to appear. The ribbons matched campaigns I had barely heard of. The names of battles came up in old newspaper archives, tied to units that had been through unspeakable things. And then I found it, a reference to a unit number stamped faintly on the back of one photo. A division sent to the front lines during one of the ugliest stretches of the war. Men who returned, but never whole. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became. My father hadn't just served. He had lived through things I couldn't even imagine. And suddenly, I was left with one question that wouldn't let me go. If he went through all that, how could he sit across from me at dinner, smile, and never say a word? For the next few days, I lived two lives. By day, I went to work, answered emails, sat through endless meetings. By night, I turned into some kind of amateur historian. The kitchen table stayed covered in old photographs and clippings, my laptop screen glowing long past midnight. I learned to recognize details I'd never noticed before. The patch on my father's sleeve in one photo. I traced it back to a specific battalion. The backdrop of another picture, a ruined church in a European town, bombed to rubble. With each discovery, I felt like I was being pulled into a story far bigger and darker than the man I thought I knew. But it wasn't just research anymore. It was obsession. I started ordering books about that war. I combed through declassified records. I even found a half-broken online forum where veterans' families traded scraps of information like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. One night, I stumbled across something that made my breath catch. A casualty list from my father's battalion. Pages of names, hundreds of them, men who never came home. And in the margin, handwritten notes from some long-forgotten officer. Severe losses. Psychological toll extreme. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. The thought hit me like a punch. My father had walked through hell, and I had lived my entire life beside a man who carried that silence without letting it slip. For the first time, I didn't just feel curious. I felt ashamed, because maybe the quiet, unremarkable life he built wasn't ordinary at all. Maybe it was his victory. I don't know what I was expecting when I dove into those dusty records. But late one night, eyes burning from staring at my laptop, I found it. Buried in a scanned newspaper from the late 70s, there was a short article about a reunion of veterans. A grainy photo showed a row of aging men, their medals pinned proudly on their jackets. And there, sitting on the far left, was my father. Younger, stronger, but unmistakable. The article listed the names of the men in the photo. Most were marked with deceased in the archive, but one name still had an address attached. James Whitaker. The more I read, the more it seemed like fate. James had been in the same battalion, fought in the same campaigns. If anyone could tell me who my father really was, it had to be him. I hesitated for days. What if he didn't remember? What if he didn't want to remember? But the not knowing was worse. So I called. The phone rang twice before a frail but steady voice answered. Hello. I stumbled through an introduction, explaining I was the son of Robert Miller. There was a long silence on the line, and then almost a whisper. Bobby's boy. After all these years. My heart pounded. Yes, sir. I never really knew him. I was hoping you could tell me what kind of man he was. Another pause, then a sigh, heavy with memory. There are things you should know, things he never told you. And just like that, the decision was made. I booked a train ticket the very next morning. For the first time, I wasn't just digging through papers and pixels. I was about to step into my father's past, face to face. The train ride felt endless. My mind kept looping between excitement and dread. What if James Whitaker looked at me and saw only a stranger? What if all I found were more questions? His house sat on the edge of a quiet town, a single-story home with a faded flag swaying in the breeze. The lawn was neat, the kind that spoke of discipline long ingrained. When the door opened, I froze. James stood there, tall despite his years, his frame still carrying the weight of soldier. His hair was white, but his eyes sharp, piercing, the kind that had seen too much. You've got your father's jaw, he said, studying me like I was a puzzle piece from a box he thought was long lost. I stepped inside. The walls were lined with black and white photographs. Young men in uniform, frozen in time. Medals gleamed from a display case. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and old books. We sat in his living room, and for a while, there was only silence. Finally, James leaned forward, his hands trembling just slightly as he reached for a glass of water. Your father wasn't the man you thought he was, he said slowly. He wasn't just a quiet accountant living in the suburbs. He carried things, heavy things from the war. Some of them he never put down. My pulse quickened. What do you mean? James's gaze locked onto mine. I mean your father did things to keep his men alive. Things no one ever wrote in the history books. And sometimes survival demands choices you'll never want to hear about. His voice dropped lower, almost to a whisper. Bobby saved lives. But the way he did it, some would call it heroic. Others might not forgive it. The room seemed to shrink around me. My father, the quiet man who never raised his voice, who kept ledgers and balance sheets, had been someone I barely recognized. And I had the sudden, terrifying sense that I'd only scraped the surface. James leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the medals on the wall. His jaw tightened, like every word he was about to say carried a weight that hadn't lifted in 50 years. It was winter, 1972, he began. Cold that cut right through you. Colder than anything I'd ever felt. We were deep in hostile territory, running low on supplies. Bobby, your father, was our second in command. He wasn't the loudest man in the unit, but when he spoke, you listened. He paused, his hands clasping together, knuckles white. We were ambushed in the middle of the night. Gunfire, chaos, men shouting in the dark. We were outnumbered 3-1. And that's when Bobby made a call that still haunts me. My throat went dry. What did he do? James's eyes flicked to mine, sharp, searching, almost as if he needed me to be strong enough to hear it. He ordered us to retreat. But not everyone could make it out. There were wounded men, too many. If we stayed, we'd all die. So Bobby, he stayed behind just long enough to set charges. Blew the bridge as we crossed. Saved the rest of us. He swallowed hard. But those men who couldn't walk? They were still on the other side. The room went silent except for the ticking of an old clock. My chest ached. I wanted to protest, to argue, to find some way to justify it. But the truth was staring at me in James's trembling hands. My father, the gentle man who balanced checkbooks, had once decided who lived and who didn't. James's voice cracked. Don't you see? That's the kind of man your father was. Not cruel, not careless, but burdened with choices no one should have to make. He saved dozens that night, but he never forgave himself for the ones he left. I sat frozen, my mind spinning. For the first time, I understood why my father had lived so quietly, why his eyes always seemed to be somewhere else. The accountant I grew up with was a mask, and behind it was a man who carried ghosts. James's voice grew quieter, as if saying the next part out loud might summon ghosts neither of us wanted in the room. After that night, after the bridge, Bobby was never the same. He kept fighting, sure, but something in him cracked. He started carrying this little notebook everywhere. Wrote in it after every mission. Never let anyone read it. Not even me. He leaned forward, his old eyes boring into mine. One night, after too much whiskey, he told me something I'll never forget. He said, "If I don't make it home, promise me you'll tell her." A chill ran through me. Tell who? I asked. James shook his head slowly. That's just it. He never gave me a name. Only an initial. L. L. I repeated. Yeah, could have been a woman. Could have been a friend. I don't know. But I swore to him I'd carry that message if he didn't make it. I sat back, trying to process it. All my life, I thought my father was a man of simple routines. Breakfast at 7, work at 9, dinner at 6. Now I was staring at a version of him who wrote secret notes in the dead of night and carried unspoken promises across a battlefield. Do you think this L is still alive? I asked. James exhaled, his breath shaky. After 50 years? Maybe, maybe not. But if you really want to understand your father, I think that's where you start looking. Whoever L was, Bobby carried them in his heart till the day he died. I felt a strange mix of fear and determination building inside me. My father's wasn't just bullets and explosions. It was secrets. It was connections I'd never known. And now, the letter L was burned into my mind. Back home, I couldn't stop thinking about that single letter. L. It felt like a code I had to crack. I pulled out every box of my father's belongings I could find. Old tax documents, birthday cards, faded photos. Most of it was as dull as you'd expect from an accountant's life. But then, tucked inside a cracked leather wallet, I found something different. A photograph. It was small, almost worn through at the edges. My father in uniform, arm around another soldier. And next to them, a young woman, smiling, her hair pinned back in a style that screamed late 70s. On the back, written in my father's sharp handwriting, were just 2 words. Pharrell. My heart kicked hard in my chest. Who was she? A lover? A sister? A comrade's wife? The possibilities swirled like a storm in my head. I scanned the photo carefully. Behind the 3 of them stood a diner sign, half visible but still readable. Mayfield Cafe. I grabbed my laptop and started searching. It took a while, but I found it, or at least what was left of it. The cafe had shut down decades ago, but the building was still standing in a small town 2 hours from where James lived. For the first time, the trail felt real. I held the photo up to the light, staring at that smiling woman. Something in her eyes, kind, knowing, pulled me in. Maybe James was right. Maybe finding Elle was the only way to truly know my father. And now I had a place to start. The town was smaller than I expected. 2-lane roads, old brick storefronts, and a kind of quiet that made every footstep echo. The Mayfield Cafe had long since been converted into an antique shop, its neon sign rusting above the door. I pushed inside, the little bell over the entrance chiming. The smell of dust and old would hit me immediately. A woman behind the counter looked up from her magazine. She had that patient air of someone who'd seen the same faces for decades, which meant she'd notice a stranger like me right away. "Can I help you?" she asked. I pulled the photo from my pocket, careful not to crease it any further. I'm looking for information. Do you recognize this place? She leaned forward, adjusting her glasses. Lord, that's the old cafe, all right. Haven't seen it look like that in 40 years. Her eyes narrowed on the people in the picture. She tapped the face of a young woman with her finger. That there's Linda. Linda Cooper. Sweet girl. Used to work here mornings before her classes. Everyone in town loved her. My chest tightened. Linda, do you know what happened to her? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The woman gave me a long look, her expression softening. She's still around. Live just a few streets over. Keeps to herself mostly. Lost her husband young, never remarried. Why do you ask? I slipped the photo back into my wallet, pulse racing. Because I think she knew my father. The woman gave me directions. As I stepped back into the sunlight, the streets of Mayfield felt different, alive, buzzing with the weight of answers I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. Linda Cooper, the woman behind the letter, and possibly the key to unlocking who my father truly was. Her house was small, painted a soft yellow that had begun to fade with time. Wind chimes clinked gently on the porch, and a pair of well-kept flower pots framed the door. It was the kind of home that looked lived in, loved, and private. I stood there for a long moment before I finally knocked. The door creaked open, and there she was. Older now, of course, her once dark hair silvered, her posture slower, but her eyes were the same as in the photo. Sharp, warm, watchful. Yes? She asked, her voice cautious but not unkind. I swallowed, suddenly aware of how crazy this might sound. Are you Linda Cooper? She nodded slowly. I am. Do I know you? I pulled out the photo, holding it out with a hand that trembled slightly. I think you knew my father, Robert Miller. The change in her expression was instant. Her lips parted, and her hand came up to her chest as if she'd been struck. Bobby, she whispered. Her eyes flicked up to mine, widening, studying my face. You're his son. It wasn't a question. It was a certainty. I nodded. I never really knew who he was. But I think you did. And I need to understand him. For a long moment, Linda just stood there in the doorway, her gaze distant, her breath uneven. Then, with a quiet sigh, she stepped aside. Come in, she said. It's time someone finally knew the truth. As I crossed the threshold, a chill ran through me. I wasn't just stepping into Linda's home. I was stepping into the part of my father's life he'd locked away forever. Linda led me into her living room. The walls were lined with bookshelves, photo frames, and the quiet comfort of a life lived in routines. A pot of tea steamed gently on the table, as if she'd been expecting company. She lowered herself into an armchair, motioning for me to sit across from her. For a while, she just stared at the photograph in my hand, her fingers tracing its edges. I haven't seen this picture in decades, she murmured. That was taken the week before everything changed. My chest tightened. Change how? She looked at me, her gaze steady. Your father and I, we weren't lovers. That's probably what you've been wondering. No, what bound us was something deeper, something forged in the fire of that war. My brother, Daniel, was in their unit. He was one of the men Bobby couldn't save. Her voice caught, but she forced herself to continue. After Daniel's death, Bobby came to me. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to explain away the impossible choice he'd had to make. He just promised me he'd never let my brother's name be forgotten. That's why he kept writing in that notebook of his. Every soldier, every story. He wanted the truth, remembered. I sat stunned. The letter, L hadn't been for a lover. It was for Linda, the woman who had carried her brother's absence all these years. Why didn't he ever tell me? I whispered. Her eyes softened. Because he wanted to protect you. He carried the weight so you wouldn't have to. But I think he also hoped that one day you'd find me. That you'd know your father wasn't just an accountant. He was a man who bore the guilt of others and still tried to live a decent life. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. For the first time, I felt like I was starting to see him, not just as a father, but as a man. Linda leaned back, her voice low but firm. Your father wasn't perfect, but he was braver than he ever gave himself credit for. And now, maybe it's time you carried not his guilt, but his truth. Linda stood slowly, her movements careful but deliberate. She disappeared into the back room, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the quiet ticking of an old clock. When she returned, she was holding a small tin box. It was dented, the paint chipped, but she cradled it like it was made of glass. "This," she said softly, "is the only thing your father ever left with me." She set it on the table and opened it. Inside, wrapped in yellowed paper, was a single page torn from a notebook. The handwriting was sharp, slanted, unmistakably my father's. I leaned closer, my pulse pounding. It wasn't a letter to Linda. It wasn't even addressed to anyone. It was a list. Names, dates, places. Beside some names, a single word, fallen. Beside others, saved. And at the very bottom, in darker ink, one line stood out. For Daniel. And for every name I couldn't carry home. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "He kept track of them all," I whispered. Linda nodded, her eyes glistening. "He wanted someone to remember. He wanted me to know he hadn't forgotten my brother. And now, I think he wanted you to know too." I held the page carefully, as though it might crumble in my hands. For the first time, I felt like I was holding not just a piece of paper, but the weight my father had carried for decades. And suddenly, I understood why he had been so quiet, why he lived a life of routine and calm. It wasn't cowardice or smallness. It was his way of surviving the ghosts. Linda's voice broke the silence. He wasn't just a man haunted by what he did. He was a man who loved fiercely, even in silence. "Don't let his story die with you,"